Week 12 is in the books, and in a normal college football season, that would mean all we have left is rivalry week. But this year, we were given an extra week, 2 bye weeks for every team, 14 weeks in the regular season. If you're wondering why that is, it's simply the college football season goes from Labor Day weekend to Thanksgiving weekend, and we just had an extra Saturday in that time period. So that's why we have 14 weeks this year and 2 bye weeks for every team. I think that's going to be the case next year as well. Anyways, back to week 12. You look at the schedule coming into this week, and it seemed like it was kind of a quiet week. There was really only the one big game. It wasn't the most exciting weekend, but we did have some great games, some close games, some upsets. It was a good weekend of college football, but we'll start with that big game, that one big game. It was clearly the game of the week. We're talking about Tennessee, Georgia, and my takeaway is just the fact that Georgia is not done. Georgia is not done in terms of being that team that could win a national championship this year. And I was actually thinking about this before this game, before this week. If you look at when Georgia has struggled this season, all right, we start with Kentucky. They didn't play great against Kentucky. That was a road game. They didn't play great in the first half against Alabama. Of course, they came back and almost won that game. But that was also a road game. They didn't play well at all against Ole Miss. That was a road game. You look at the games that they've had at home, they really have not had much at all. They had Auburn at home. They had Mississippi State at home. And then they had this game against Tennessee. So I think that that's something that gets overlooked when we talk about this schedule. They're 3-2 against top 25 teams, I believe. And most of those games were away from home. The Florida game was away from home. It wasn't on the road, a true road game, but that was away from home. They didn't play great in that game either. You look at the Clemson game. First half didn't play great there as either. But I just think that this Georgia team has the potential to still be a really, really good team. And we saw that, in the second half against Tennessee. They really looked solid. They looked like, Tennessee's a good football team. And Georgia, they went in there and took care of business in that second half. You look at what they did against Texas, even though that game was actually on the road. So they have been able to do it on the road. Just, again, most of their struggles have been on the road. And then you look at the Alabama game in the second half. So, we've seen Georgia at times look like that elite team. We just haven't seen it consistently. And if they're able to get fully healthy, time to prepare, I still think this is going to be a dangerous team in the college football playoff. And they're pretty much locked into the playoff now. We'll get to that in just a second with one of my other takeaways. But my number 2 takeaway, people are sleeping on Notre Dame. Notre Dame has just kind of been quietly dominating these games. And it's very similar, I guess, to what Indiana's been doing. So Indiana has been blowing out teams that aren't great. Notre Dame's kind of been doing the same thing. If you look at their dominance and what they've been able to do in these games, Notre Dame, if they did not have the slip up against Northern Illinois, Notre Dame might be number 1 or at least number 2 right now. I think they'd probably be number 2. And they've got that great win over Texas A&M, of course, for week 1. But yeah, this was a game against Virginia that I thought, in years past, Notre Dame, these are the types of games where, they'll not look great. They'll let the team hang around. Maybe they win it, but it's not, just complete domination. And really, that from start to finish, they were clearly the better team. They were focused. The defense is very, very good. I think Riley Leonard, he's not the best quarterback in the country, but he gives them something there at that position that I think they need. And it's just a good Notre Dame football team. And I think it's another team that you can't count out in the college football playoff. I think Georgia being overlooked. I think Notre Dame is being overlooked. Again, I know Notre Dame is ranked. They're ranked high enough where they're going to get in the playoff, assuming they win out. But I do think they're being overlooked a little bit by fans in general as being a team that, you just dismiss them because they lost to Northern Illinois. They've been beating a bunch of bad teams. I think this Notre Dame team is legit, and I think they're potentially going to surprise in the college football playoff. All right, let's move on to number 3. Clemson puts the pressure on Miami. All right, so Clemson is done in ACC play. They finished with 2 losses. With 1 conference loss, 2 losses overall. 1 conference loss, that means they're tied with Miami. I do believe Miami is still going to win the tiebreaker, assuming they win out. But Miami has to win out. They cannot lose a game. And I actually haven't looked at it. The tiebreaker was Louisville the common opponent. Well, Louisville just lost, so they're going to go drop further down in the standings. I still don't think, because Miami lost to Georgia Tech, Clemson didn't play Georgia Tech, so I still think that Miami is going to win the tiebreaker here. But it is it's there's no guarantee they're going to win out. So yeah, the pressure is on Miami. They've got to win these final 2 games. There's no like tiebreaker situation for them. If they lose a game, Clemson will be ahead of them because Clemson's done. They can't lose. And just this game in general with Clemson and Pitt, boy, that was an ugly game. I mean, have you ever seen any game like this? I just go back to the situation with Pitt, where they had the ball on like the 1 yard line. They had a time. They call it timeout because the play clock's winding down. They get an illegal formation penalty coming out of the timeout. Then they got a delay a game after a penalty, and I think maybe a false start back to like this. There were so many situations like that in this game with penalties and just ugly football, and still looked like Pitt was going to win. And then Cade Klubnik with that big run to win the game for Clemson. It was an ugly game, but it was a dramatic finish. Let's just put it that way. A dramatic finish. This was one I was locked into there at the end. But yeah, Clemson. I mean, is there a team in the ACC, honestly, that you think is going to compete in the playoff? Maybe Miami if they play their A+ game, but I don't know if there is. I don't think Clemson's that great. They've got a lot of injuries, depth issues, problem there. SMU barely squeaked by against Boston College. It's just, I don't think the ACC has an elite team. I don't think the Big 12 has an elite team either. And they won't be getting 2 teams in the college football playoff. We now know that. So BYU loses. Look, if BYU loses in the Big 12 championship, I just do not see them getting in the college football playoff. I just don't think it's going to happen. I'd say like less than 10% chance that they get in that scenario. So it's really just going to be about who wins the Big 12 championship. And it's down to 4 teams now. BYU, Colorado, Arizona State, and Iowa State. How about Arizona State's performance against Kansas State? Really, really impressive. I talked about them last week. I know they hadn't beaten anyone, but this is a good football team, and they showed it there in that game. And I believe Arizona State plays Colorado this week, if I'm not mistaken. So if they win that game, then we're talking about Arizona State, BYU potentially in the Big 12 championship. Or if BYU slips up, maybe wind up with Colorado. There's a lot of different ways this could go with still some conference games left for these teams. They actually all have 2 conference games left. So what happens if, I guess, I say it's down to 4, but what if BYU and Colorado both lose 2 games? Arizona State loses a game or Iowa State loses a game? Maybe one of these 3-loss teams could jump back in there, which is actually what I said weeks ago. I thought we'd probably have a 3-loss team win the Big 12, and then BYU and Iowa State kind of separated themselves, and then Iowa State, now they've lost. Look, it's hard to go undefeated, and we know that. BYU, Miami, look at these teams. They keep just barely winning games. Eventually, it's going to catch up to you. Can BYU bounce back? Can they win out? If they win out, they will. BYU and Colorado control their own destiny. If they win out, they will be in the Big 12 championship game. But yeah, it feels like a 3-loss team's done, unless, again, we get some chaos here in the Big 12. Could happen, but I'm going to say it's very unlikely. But yeah, Colorado, very impressive in their win against Utah. They look good. Arizona State looked good. This is going to be interesting, seeing how this comes down here at the end. And potentially, again, Colorado-Arizona State, a game that will decide who goes to the Big 12 championship. All right, final takeaway. SEC, well, it's down to 6 teams. Missouri goes down to South Carolina. LSU goes down to Florida. And we're down to these 6 teams. So Texas A&M, if they win this next weekend, they'll be playing in a game where the winner goes to the SEC championship. And that'll be very exciting if it does come down to that. Also, though, don't forget about Texas A&M's got to go on the road at night to play Auburn in Jordan-Hare this Saturday. That's a tough place to play. Don't overlook that game. What happens if they lose that game, but then they beat Texas? We're right back to that 6-way tie. And I haven't looked at the updated tiebreaker. I believe before it was LSU then Alabama. They had the advantages, so I assume Alabama would be in. I'm not really sure who that next team is. I'm sure this week somebody will calculate the tiebreakers and we'll look at that and see what it's looking like. But that's going to be interesting because, again, if that happens, if Texas A&M were to lose to Auburn and then beat Texas, we're going to have potentially a 6-way tie here. But I think if one of those teams wins out, they're going to be in, and it feels like unless Alabama gets upset, it's going to be Alabama versus the winner of Texas A&M in the SEC championship. But crazy things could still happen. Tennessee has to play Vanderbilt. Alabama has to play Oklahoma and Auburn. Ole Miss, you feel like they're in great shape. They should be there. They've got a very favorable schedule here at the end. Georgia's done. They're 6-2. So there's still a lot of football left. I know you think it's probably Texas A&M winner is going to be there and they'll play Alabama. That's the most likely scenario. But upsets happen. There are still games to be played, and there are definitely potential upsets here around the corner in the SEC. So that's going to be a fun race. Again, the Big 12 and the SEC races, very, very exciting this year. The ACC, it's just going to come down to Miami. If they win out, they'll be in. If they lose, Clemson will be in. Unless SMU were to lose their final 2 conference games. I think they still have 2 conference games, but that's very unlikely. And then the Big 10, it's going to be, it looks like, Oregon versus the winner of Ohio State, Indiana. So those races maybe not as complicated, but yeah, the Big 12 and SEC, very complicated. These are my takeaways from an entertaining Week 12. Again, not a lot of marquee matchups, but still some great football, and we'll see what happens here in these final 2 weeks. Give me your takeaways on Week 12 down in the comments below.